All right, thanks very much, Randy and everyone. It's great to be on this illustrious panel. It really is quite a group we have here. It strikes me coming to a conversation like this that we've only really been having the conversation about value added for maybe 5 years. And most things in education you can go back and read a history book about, the curriculum and testing and textbooks. All these things go back a very long way. Value added is something that just sort of popped on the screen. Researchers have been talking about it. People in Tennessee knew about it. But for the most part, the national conversation was not there. And then suddenly, partly as a result of some of Tom's early work and Rick Hanishek's and others, the value-added measures started to draw a lot more attention, and that then precipitated a conversation about teacher evaluation. And I think the value-added measures are important in part, and maybe even mainly, because they've created this conversation and created this debate and now created a whole new set of policies around teacher performance and teacher evaluation that we probably wouldn't have had otherwise. Like, I don't think if the value-added measures hadn't come, I don't think any of these policies would have come into being. And so I think that's probably the most important thing that they've accomplished. But now we're here, we have to figure out what to do with them, right? And that's what the debate has been about. So what I'm going to do is two things. One is to try to put a little precision on what the positions might be on value added, especially in terms of the level of stakes we might attach to them. And then I was asked to talk about a proposal I put forward, a different way of using value added measures other than the ways in which districts and states are currently using them. So that's what I'm going to do. So the first way to think about this, the formatting got all messed up here, but basically the idea here is you have a continuum from low to high on the amount of stakes that we get attached to value added. And I'm going to go through 5 different possibilities. These are not exhaustive. You could come up with a different way of creating these categories. And then I'm going to talk in particular about the one that I was asked to talk about. So the first position you could take, lowest stakes possible, would be no value added at all. Forget about it. We're not going to, no value added. We're not going to go there. This position tends to come from those who are generally opposed to high stakes testing. And so this is going to come back later in the panel discussion when we talk about the E.D. Hirsch piece that was written recently. The second position would be, with a little bit more aggressive use, would be just use it for identifying patterns of performance, the role of experience, the effects of different kinds of professional development programs, but not to hold any individual teacher accountable for performance. Now the third one is the one that I'm going to talk about. That's the quote-unquote new option. So we're going to leave that. That one I'm going to put in the middle of all these. The number 4 option is really what the race to the top states are doing. This is where teacher value add is going to be one of the factors associated or part of the performance measure, but not the only one. That it's clearly part of multiple measures. It's not the primary measure, but it's playing a role in high stakes employment decisions. And then the 5th and most aggressive would be that value added should be the primary measure. Now, very few people take this 5th position, but it is suggested sometimes. When we see studies talking about what would happen if we fired a certain X percentage of teachers, of the lowest value-added teachers, that doesn't explicitly state that we should have such a policy where that's the only measure, but it's sort of suggested by the way in which the analysis is taking place. So we don't hear that one very often. But I think this sort of encapsulates the range of positions that we could have here. There's a lot of nuance that's missing in that categorization, but I think this helps frame the discussion, and maybe Linda and Tom can think about their positions in terms of this. We can have a concrete conversation about how our positions might differ. The nuances that are missing here are things like, well, are we using value added only to evaluate teams of teachers versus individual teachers? Are we trying to evaluate all teachers with value added, or only those in traditionally tested grades and subjects? Things like that. So there are lots of nuances here, but I still think we're capturing the main piece with that first continuum. All right, and I've already talked about, one other interesting point here too is in these conversations on value added, it strikes me, I'm often on these sort of pro-con panels, and it strikes me that oftentimes the supporters of value added usually will start off by saying, it's really important that we have better measures, that teachers are really important, and that value added can be a really important part, but there are these problems, there are these caveats, and so we shouldn't use it as the only measure. Opponents will start at the other end and say, well, look at all these problems. This is terrible. We can't possibly think about using this for teacher evaluation. But then say, well, but it might be useful as one part of multiple measures, right? So the positions in the end up being not very different. The tone of the conversation is quite different, and the way in which the arguments get made are quite different. But there isn't that much disagreement about the facts. And I think even on the bottom line, there doesn't seem to be that much difference in terms of at least the researchers who are working on this in terms of where they come down on using it. All right, so let me come back now to number 3. What's this alternative way of thinking about value added? Well, the first thing to think about here is kind of how we got where we are and where we are right now with value added. So right now, the race to the top has sort of nudged districts and states into a particular policy direction. That is to take value added, take a classroom observation, maybe take some other things, and lump it all together into a weighted average measure of teacher performance, and then make high-stakes decisions based on that composite measure. Why are we doing this? Partly because the race to the top policy was kind of vague. It said student achievement has to be a significant factor in the determination of teacher performance. Now, if you're a state or a district and you're trying to get a competitive grant, you're going to try to meet that requirement as clearly as possible. What's the simplest thing to do? Create a composite measure and assign a number to it. Right? If you want to say something's a significant factor, assign a number to it. Really, the only way to do that is with a composite measure. So that naturally nudged districts and states in that direction. It was also probably the most intuitive and the first thing that a district might think about, or a state might think about in applying for these things, because we do this all the time, right? We have consumers' reports that takes different parts of cars and refrigerators and create an overall quality measure. We have heat indexes that take temperature, combine it with humidity. Believe me, in New Orleans, the heat index matters a lot. We have, if you follow football at all, college football has these, the BCS rankings that take all sorts of different things, lump it together into some index, and then that's where the rankings of the colleges come from. So it's an intuitive thing to do. But it's not necessarily the best thing to do. One problem with it is cost, right? So if you're going to do that, you have to collect all the information on all the teachers. Right, that's expensive, right? To do these classroom observations and to do them well, part of this is what came out of the MET project, that even classroom observations can be unreliable. So if you're going to do this, if you're going to observe every teacher and you're going to do it 5 times a year, that takes resources. It takes the time of administrators, teachers, and others involved. And they're already struggling, financially struggling and struggling with the time that they have now. So that's something that we have to pay attention to. The unintended consequence of getting states or inducing states to now try to test in every grade and subject. If we're going to be fair about it, and we think by fairness we mean we're going to apply the same framework to every teacher, then that means we have to collect the same information for every teacher. That means we have to expand testing to every grade and subject. So states like Florida, this is what they're doing. They're going to test everything. We're going to go down to kindergarten. We're going to test that. We're going to test art. We're going to test music. Just test it all. Then you can come up with a value-added measure. Okay. I don't think most people think that's a great idea, but that's one response if you want to be fair about it. Validity. So one problem with value added in general, and the focus on high stakes testing in general, is the negative form of teaching to the test. And so I'm distinguishing this from aligning the curriculum, because some people would say teaching to the test is good to the degree it aligns teaching with the curriculum. Okay, we'll leave that aside, but there are all sorts of bad forms of teaching to the test that are very prevalent. So there are lots of reasons why we might be concerned about doing it this way. So what's the new option? So the new option is what I call a screening approach, and this involves 2 different steps. One is to take value-added measures in a first stage of a 2-step process, in which the first stage is taking less quality, less clear information, and making a determination about which teachers you need to collect more information on. Right? So you'd use the value-added measure plus a little bit of other information to decide, all right, these teachers are sort of on the margin of whatever decision we're trying to make, whether it's at the low end, trying to make a tenure decision, or at the high end, trying to decide who's going to get performance pay. You would decide based on that initial cut who you need to collect more information on. Then in the second stage, you would get higher quality information on those teachers who are on the margin. So that's the first part of the screening. So I use the word screening because what's happening is you're using this first stage to screen teachers, put them in categories for the second stage. Second problem is trying to find some way to improve the classroom observation. So I think there's pretty wide agreement now that the classroom observation is really going to be the heart and should be the heart of teacher performance measurement and accountability. So if that's the case, we need some way to make sure validity on those is high. And there are all sorts of things that can go wrong there as well, right? We can have observers who are not very well trained. We can have personal biases come into play. If it's somebody in the school who knows the teacher, you can worry about personality biases. I've talked to principals about how they hire teachers, and they'll often say, well, I didn't like this teacher because I know this teacher had a good relationship with the previous principal, and I didn't like the previous principal. So, I mean, you can see all these different personal issues get involved, and it's not just schools that have this problem. This happens in any organization. So we want to have some way of trying to prevent that and to improve the classroom observations as well. And so you can use the value-added measure for this as well, because one thing we've seen clearly in the research is that there tends to be a correlation within a certain range between the value-added measure and the classroom observation. And so if you saw a really high correlation, you'd probably be worried that people are going into the classroom knowing what the value-added score is and just creating a classroom observation that happens to align with what the observer already knows about value-added. On the low end, you might be worried if all these personality issues are coming into play that there might be no correlation or a negative correlation, and that would just be a flag. It wouldn't be determinative. You wouldn't fire the observer if the correlation wasn't right, but it would be a flag where you could go and collect other information, maybe provide other training to the observers, go in and at least check what's going on. So the idea here is both to improve the data collection, the direct data collection for the teachers, and simultaneously to improve the classroom observations using value-added. So part of the analogy here comes from healthcare. So one thing that happens commonly in healthcare is that we have a screening test. You go in, if you're gonna test for some disease, they will often give what's called the screening test first. It's a test that will capture everybody who might have the disease, but will screen out a lot of people who don't. And then in the second stage, then they have a second test, which would be the gold standard test, which has nearly 100% accuracy. That one's much more expensive, right? So you wouldn't want to give the gold standard test to everybody because it just costs too much. So you can see where the analogy is coming from here, right? Just a lot cheaper to do it this way. It's more efficient to collect the information this way than to apply the best information you possibly can to everybody equally. It's just not very efficient. All right, now some would call this a triage approach. It's something like triage, but I think screening is a better term for this. All right, so what are the advantages here? Cost is one obvious advantage. So it's going to be cheaper because you're going to focus your data collection efforts on those teachers who you have good reason to think are on that performance margin. Could increase validity by increasing the quality of the classroom observations, could reduce the negative form of teaching to the test, because now the final, so one thing that should be clear now is the final decision doesn't get made based on value added anymore, if value added is only in the screening stage. All the value added is doing directly then is guiding the information collection. It's not actually part of the final decision anymore. So there's less of an incentive to game the system to teach to the test in harmful ways. It's fairness because you no longer have to have the high-stakes test in every grade and subject. You don't have to have it in music and art, and yet you're still applying the same process because the value added wouldn't be the only part of the screening process. So, and the final decisions then would be made the same way for everybody based on the classroom observation. So it's also fairer than what we're doing now, at least fairer in the sense that if we don't also have to go get all these additional tests. Okay, so those are the advantages. There are some more ambiguous properties. What it would do to reliability is a little bit unclear. If it does improve the classroom observations, it could improve reliability in that sense. On the other hand, combining measures together, again, as the Met study shows, can increase reliability. So it's not entirely clear what the net effect is there. All right. So one important thing to point out here is that this process, this alternative way of doing it, would only make sense with certain combinations of measures. So I've been talking about the classroom observation and the value-added measure as being the two. Both of those focus on classroom instruction. That's the intent is to measure the quality of classroom instruction in very different ways. If you were using, say, the informal rubric from the principal that might include things like what the teacher contributes to the school community and other things that are distinct from classroom observation, this might not make a lot of sense. You wouldn't use a screening device based on value added to then decide whether you're going to collect information on whether teachers are contributing to the school community. That wouldn't make a lot of sense. It only works if both of the measures you're working with are measuring the same general thing. So why aren't districts and states doing this? I think, again, part of the reason is race to the top. I've talked to districts about it. They say, we'd love to do this, except our state says no. We're a race to the top state. It says we can't do it. So they're a bit stuck right now. I don't think the department has a clear position on whether something like this would count achievement as a significant factor or not. I'm also writing a policy brief, a longer version of this that's going to come out from the Carnegie Foundation for the Advancement of Teaching, I think next month, so you'll be able to get more details from that. But I think the larger point, right, so I was asked to talk about this specific plan. The larger point here is that we need to have a broader range of experimentation. We don't know a lot about the best way to use multiple measures. What we do know is that most places are doing pretty much the same thing, and yet they would want to be trying different things. And so I think we need to recognize the box that we've been put into, the box really that practitioners have been put into, and the possibility of doing a broader range of things and trying new things, and then collecting evidence on it. So like I said at the beginning, we've only been in this for 5 years. We know very little about the effectiveness of using value added for high stakes in general, and we know even less about how different practices might work because we haven't really been trying a very broad range of practices. So I think that's the main message. I'm not trying to sell this, make a hard sell on this idea, but I think it's a useful one for showing how we might go about this in a different way. So thank you.